Historical Society. I'm Paul Watermolder, and I chair this board of directors who are meeting today and tomorrow. So directors from all across the country are very pleased and honored to be here tonight with you. I grew up in the Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church, and in 1962 we began a close relationship with a black church in West Philadelphia. And I remember as a ninth grader playing basketball with and painting the gymnasium with members of the youth group in that church, and finding it natural as could be to have friendships that were both black and white and were totally equal in Christ. It didn't take me long during the high school years to discover that was not everybody's situation, and that the world was not made up of people who were brothers and sisters in Christ. Tonight we are going to hear a great presentation put together by Dr. Fred Huser on the matter of Presbyterians being involved in civil rights. I welcome you to the Historical Society, where all nature of the past courage and strength and mercy and justice of those who went before us is on display. And I hope you come and make good use of the Historical Society week in and week out, whether there's a presentation or not. So you've braved the elements such as they are, and our evening progresses as Dr. Huser now speaks with us.
Good evening and welcome. My responsibility tonight is actually to set the stage, to provide the context, to talk about Presbyterians and the civil rights movement. And the thrust of tonight's presentation will be four speakers who will share with us their memories of that time. So in a sense, to put this in more of a musical context, Paul and I are the opening acts for the stars who will be sharing their thoughts. Before I share my thoughts, I want to call your attention to several things. The Presbyterian Historical Society, of course, is the national archives for the Presbyterian Church USA. Our mission is to collect, to preserve, and to share the story of the American Presbyterian experience. We do that in a variety of ways, and one way that I would hope you would have an opportunity to look at is the spring-summer issue of the Journal of Presbyterian History, which focuses on the subject of Presbyterians and the civil rights movement. We have an exhibit in the back. We hope you'll take a look at that. It was prepared by our archival staff and our professional staff. So I welcome you to PHS, and as Paul said, I hope that you will come back and visit many times. In his civil rights memoir, entitled Lay Bare the Heart, the late civil rights activist James Farmer recalls an incident while participating with the Freedom Riders in Mississippi during the 1960s. As the bus crossed the Mississippi state line, its youthful occupants began to sing in order to break the tension of an anticipated clash with Mississippi Klansmen and others. With weary voices, they sang these words: "I'm taking a ride on the Greyhound bus line. I'm riding the front seat." Jackson did this time. "Hallelujah, I'm traveling. Hallelujah, ain't it fine. Hallelujah, I'm traveling down freedom's main line." In 1954, the Supreme Court has said, "Look at here, Mr. Jim Crow, it's time you were dead." Farmer remembered, after singing a number of verses, that we felt better. Song stiffens the spine. Sleep deprived, they entered into Mississippi. When he pulled into Jackson, Farmer recalled, there was an eerie stillness. The streets were nearly deserted. The ambush that was predicted did not materialize. But when the bus pulled into the terminal, a sea of white faces, solemn and unexpressive, awaited us, he wrote. It was all very civilized. The nation was now watching this through newsreel cameras. Bigotry had many faces, he wrote. And unlike Alabama, where Klan hooliganism had been allowed to run amok, Mississippi was putting on its best face. Nonetheless, after being ordered to disperse 3 times by the captain of the local police, he commented, "We were arrested for disturbing the peace, disobeying an officer, and inciting to riot." After we were being escorted to jail, we sang, "We Shall Overcome." We sang loudly to silence our own fears and to rouse our own courage. There is no armor more impenetrable than the psalm. "We Shall Overcome" became the anthem of the civil rights movement, sung by peoples of all colors, faiths, and socioeconomic classes. In August of 1963, a 22-year-old folk singer by the name of Joan Baez led a crowd of 300,000 in singing "We Shall Overcome" at the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington. President Lyndon Johnson used the phrase "We shall overcome" in addressing Congress on March 15, 1965, in a speech delivered after the violent Bloody Sunday attacks on civil rights demonstrators in Selma. Dr. Martin Luther King recited the words "We shall overcome" in his final sermon delivered in Memphis on 31 March 1968. But for Presbyterians and other peoples of faith, the song had special meaning, rooted in the gospel. Originally composed as "I'll Overcome Someday" by the Reverend Charles Albert Tindley of Philadelphia, the text bore the epigraph, "Ye shall overcome if ye faint not," and derived from Galatians, "And let us not be weary in doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not." Like Americans in general during the 1950s and 60s, Presbyterians struggled to overcome the racism that had been deeply embedded into American society since its founding. And like Americans in general, Presbyterians were divided on this issue. That racism assumed a new level in the years following the American Civil War. For despite the inclusion of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments into our Constitution, by the end of the 19th century, the concept of separate but equal, in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, had become part of the American mindset and legal landscape. Ironically, it was a Presbyterian lawyer who challenged that concept of legal separation. For in 1896, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court John M. Harlan had argued against the majority decision in the Plessy case that the Constitution was colorblind. Plessy versus Ferguson decision remained the law of the land until 1954, when the famous Brown versus Board of Education case overturned the legal foundation for segregation. The Supreme Court ended the segregation of the nation's school system, but that legal important ruling did not end the struggle for civil rights. That struggle entered a new phase in 1964. Now, it is hard to comprehend Presbyterian involvement in the struggle for civil rights from any one perspective. Like any movement that involved social change, there were various perspectives that reflected the work of individuals, organizations, and diverse governing bodies. Individual Presbyterians, congregations from throughout the country, presbyteries, and the General Assembly were caught up in the turmoil of the times, as were ecumenical organizations like the National Council and others. The story of the civil rights movement is both the story of a divided nation and a divided church. Tonight we are fortunate to have 4 individuals who are going to share their memories of the civil rights movement with us. I'm just going to introduce them briefly, but they're going to also introduce themselves. Bill Marshall is a member of our board. Bill is a retired archivist from the University of Kentucky. Shirley Satterfield has been a long-standing member of our board, a retired educator. Everyone knows Jim Reese. Jim, are you officially retired now from the Presbyterian Church USA? And my friend and colleague, Dr. Lewis Weeks, who's retired president of Union Theological Seminary and an important American historian of church history in its own right. So on that note, I'm going to turn this over to Bill Marshall to begin his sharing of memories.
Thank you, Fred. One disclaimer before I get going. At the time that I experienced this, was basically the things I'm going to talk about, I was between 17 and 23. And I was a member, actually I belonged to a UCC church at that point in time, Congregational Church. But I can assure you that I've been a Presbyterian since the mid-1970s, and that my ancestors on both sides, going well back into the 19th and 18th centuries, were dedicated Presbyterians. I became first aware of the Civil Rights Movement in 1961. I grew up in my last 6 years before I went off to college in northeastern Ohio, in a little community called Chesterland, which was in transition from becoming a rural area with lots of fruit farms to a bedroom community for Cleveland. And when I was in high school, a black or African American dentist moved into our community with his family and integrated our school system for the first time. If you can imagine, a suburban school system in the Cleveland area, we had very little diversity in our schools. They came to our church and joined our youth group. And this caused a lot of commotion in our community. And this is the North. We had an open housing meeting in our town hall, and it was incredibly contentious. One remark I remember, one man got up and said, "We left Cleveland to get away from this," and he used the N-word. It was eye-opening for a lot of us, particularly for me, as 17 years of age. Jumping to 1962, I graduated from high school and went to Heidelberg College, which is also a UCC-affiliated small liberal arts school in Tiffin, Ohio. And I was very aware at that point in time of the Civil Rights Movement. We saw images on television of the strife in Birmingham, the demonstrations, the sit-ins, and many members of our church, including our pastor, were consumed by the news. When in June of 1963, news came to us that there was a planned march on Washington to support President Kennedy's civil rights legislation, and to also support many other things, equality, jobs, fairness in housing, many different issues. Several members of the church, including those in the youth group, both senior high and college kids, we jumped at the opportunity to go. The Cleveland area participation was coordinated by the members of the St. Mark Presbyterian Church, which was a predominantly black congregation located on East Boulevard, just off site of the Case Western Reserve campus. And we departed from the Caramoo House. This would be August 27th, the evening of the 27th, on a Greyhound bus. And it was one of 15 that came out of the Cleveland area that night. There were 15 bus loads, about 3 plane loads of folks, and who knows how many people drove their automobiles. They estimate that there were over 1,500 persons who came out of Cleveland to join the march. And out of that number, about a third were white. The trip was a long one. We were all excited. There's very little apprehension. It was something where we got very little sleep. We were instructed to wear casual clothing. Men were not supposed to wear shorts, Bermuda shorts. I would have been caught dead in them anyway. To bring water and bag lunches. And we signed printed pledges saying that our behavior would be nonviolent. The buses arrived the next morning, about mid-morning, 8:30 to 9 o'clock, at assembly points. And once we got off the buses, I believe it was Constitution Avenue that we marched down. That was, in essence, the real march for us. We did not stay with our groups. I was with a couple of other kids. But the day was warm. The occasion was joyous. There had been some thought that there would be the potential for violence. I didn't see or hear a mean word issued the entire day of any kind. People carried signs, they chanted freedom, freedom. And I can't tell you, Fred, the number of times we sang, we shall overcome. I mean, it was just almost every minute. It was almost a carnival atmosphere. And I don't know if anybody else was here on the march, but I suspect you had the same kind of experience that I did. We walked hand in hand with people of different races and backgrounds whom we either hardly knew or didn't know at all. It was simply an outpouring of goodwill, but also a plea for freedom and equality for all. And then we walked around a little bit before we got settled. Once we were settled, you could not move. I mean, you were just like, you're wedged in like a sardine. We ended up a couple hundred yards away from the platform in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And we were entertained by a number of famous people: Odetta, Sammy Davis Jr., Harry Belafonte, Peter, Paul, and Mary. There were, as most of you know, there were a number of presentations and speeches given by labor leaders, civil rights leaders from various organizations like NAACP, CORE, SNCC, etc. But everybody was waiting for the finale, and the finale was Martin Luther King. Everybody wanted to hear what he had to say, and he did not disappoint. Those of you, and most of you have read his speech. It's not long, but it's the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. I can honestly say that I can't recall everything he said. It was hard to hear, but I heard a lot. One thing that really hit home for me, being who I am, Caucasian, was we cannot walk alone. He made it very clear that all of us were involved with this mess. And I also remember at the end of his speech, "Let freedom reign." And who could not possibly remember his last words? Free at last, free at last. It was certainly one of the most memorable days of my life. And I feel very honored to have participated in it. In 1964, Heidelberg College, where I was going to school, announced an exchange program with historically black colleges in the South. The exchange was arranged by the dean of the college, historian John Allen Kraut, who previously had been the vice president of Columbia University when Dwight Eisenhower was president. I had read James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. I had read John Howard Griffin's Black Like Me, and wanted to find out what it was like to be a minority student myself. I wanted to also learn about a group of fellow students from an entirely different background. I was fortunately one of the 2 male students who was chosen to participate. We selected, and the other guy that went, I knew a little bit. Both of us played intercollegiate baseball. He was on the baseball team, he was behind me. Both of us selected Talladega College in Alabama. That's the place we wanted to go. When we chose it over Fisk, which was located in Nashville, and Dillard in New Orleans, because we did not want the distraction of those 2 cities. And trust me, they would have been quite a distraction. Talladega was founded in 1869 by 2 former enslaved persons, William Savory and Thomas Tarrant. And it's Alabama's oldest black college, private black college. Interestingly, its main administration building, Swain Hall, was built right before the Civil War for a Baptist institution that never came about by enslaved labor. And the institution was, of course, affiliated with the United Church of Christ. Back after the Civil War, the Congregational Church and the Northern Presbyterian churches were considered abolitionist churches by Southerners, and indeed they were, and supported the college as a missionary institution. When I attended, there were about 300 students at Talladega, and the college I came from at Heidelberg was about 1,000. The trip there was quite interesting. We took the train, which you can't do now, from Cleveland to Cincinnati and from Cincinnati to Atlanta. And we stayed overnight at the YMCA. That's where I learned how to eat grits. From Atlanta to Anniston, Alabama, we were on the southern. And the last 5 minutes, we were up getting ready to get off, and the white conductor was a nice, at that time I think he was a nice old guy, but he probably was younger than I am now. He looked at us, and we had these big suitcases full of stuff, and they were heavy, we were lugging them around. And he said, "Where are you boys going?" And we said, "We're going to go to college." And then he looked at us and he said, "Well, where are you going?" And I looked at Jim Wyman, and we didn't want to tell him where we were going. And I mean, we were starting to get apprehensive because, you know, it's not the idea of going to a school, you know, with African American folks, but it was the idea of what was going on in 1964. And we paused, and then he stepped in and saved us. And he said, "Jacksonville State?" And we said, "Yeah." That was definitely a white lie. From Anniston, Alabama to Talladega, we took a bus. And when we got a cab at Talladega, the cab driver asked us where we were going, and we told him, and his jaw dropped. He didn't say anything. And then when we got off, he got our bags out of the trunk and looked at us and said, are you boys sure you really want to go here? And we said, "Yes, sir, we do." So I'm sure that our arrival in White Talladega, at least, in the following day was heralded. I think everybody knew that there were a couple of white kids who were going to Talladega College. And indeed we did. We roomed with Talladega students, we attended classes, we sang in the college choir, which was an incredible experience. My gosh, they could sing. Spirituals that, you know, when we sing spiritual, I sing in the choir in my church. Every time I sing a spiritual, I remember Talladega. And if you saw a picture of us, there was a picture, a couple pictures taken, and you see the choir, and it was a good sized choir, and it looks like what you see are 2 specks of salt in a sea of pepper. So I got my wish about being a minority student. I was asked to come out for the basketball team. And I played basketball in high school, and I'm glad I demurred, because when I saw the basketball team play, I would have been absolutely the token white of the team. I had never played. We were invited to join several fraternities to accept an honorary membership, and we participated in the social scene. Oh my. Talladega had a ratio of 2 females to every male. And so when you went to the campus theater, and they did not go down to the downtown theater, they basically boycotted the downtown theater for good reason. Or you went out to a dance, you know, if you're a guy, you took out 2 girls at one time. I love the intention. Another thing we did is we took, we didn't do too much involved with civil rights, but we took SNCC ballots around to the African American community in Talladega. And I got to see a lot of really neat people, got to talk to them about their lives, got to see how they lived. And some of them live pretty sparsely. Outdoor plumbing, and almost everybody had a TV set, however. They knew what was going on. And if you wonder why they had to have ballots in the election of presidential election in 1964, you could vote for Mary Goldwater, the Republican candidate, but you could not vote for Lyndon Johnson. You had to vote for pledged electors, pledged to one George Wallace. And so those SNCC ballots then went to Atlanta. I did one thing that was really stupid. There was a girl from Chicago who I got to know reasonably well, who was used to white guys like me, being from Chicago. And she said, "You know, I have a boyfriend who's having a birthday. You need to come downtown with me to pick out a present for him." And I reluctantly, because I was a little apprehensive, I don't know if that's a good idea. She said, "Oh, come on." Of course, you know, you wave a red flag in front of a guy and he'll do anything. And, you know, come on downtown with me, so I did. And as we went through the white community and then down into the downtown area of Talladega, if looks could have killed, I would have been dead many, many times. I served in Vietnam, less than a decade later, and I never felt as uncomfortable in Vietnam as I felt that day. There was just so much hatred that was, I could just see it. And I regretted going in one sense, but it was an experience again that you'll never forget. Met many fascinating people. One of my fellow students was Barbara Shores, the daughter of Arthur Davis Shores. I don't know if anybody here knows who that was, but a Birmingham civil rights attorney who worked with Thurgood Marshall and worked with Martin Luther King. And he was the person who smuggled out Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. And because of his work, he was targeted by the Ku Klux Klan, he and his family. Their house was bombed twice. Unfortunately, members of the family were killed. They lost their Cocker Spaniel. And his daughter, Barbara, was targeted for a kidnap, basically incident, and it was foiled, fortunately. But she and his sister are about to publish a book that we scheduled to come out this fall about her father and the family's experiences, entitled Gentle Giant of Dynamite Hill. And it's something I'm looking forward to seeing. We did not stay the entire year at Talladega for two reasons. They wanted us to stay, and the students who went to Heidelberg as exchange students wanted to stay for the full year. But first of all, I had to get my priorities straight. I played intercollegiate baseball, and I was not going to miss baseball season. But the second reason, and probably just as compelling, is that I was a history major. And in the first 5 minutes of the first history class I had with the only history professor, the chair of the department, I succeeded in alienating him. And in the question and answer period, since I don't want to go any much longer, if you want to ask me why, it's an interesting story, I'd be happy to tell you. What I learned? Well, my own experience in Northeastern Ohio made me realize that the battle for integration and freedom wasn't simply a Southern problem. It was instead a national problem. And from my vantage point, it was a white problem. Secondly, when we talk about the March on Washington, marginalized people found their corporate voice for the first time. Instead of the 100,000 folks that were expected, as Fred said, 300,000 showed up. 3 times the number that they expected. They would have been happy with 100,000. The largest crowd to ever register a protest in the nation's capital. And believe me, it was really something. The civil rights movement could therefore no longer be ignored. And I think that's really what this meant. Some people call it the apex. But I think this was the time that you could no longer allow people who were really hurting, people who deserved much better. Finally, my experience at Talladega confirmed for me that there was really only one race, the human race. Thank you very much.
I brought this book. It's called Hands on the Freedom Plow. This book was given to me by a couple at Nassau Presbyterian Church when I gave a tour. I gave the tour of the African American community in Princeton. And when I was reading it, it's about the women who, their accounts of the Freedom March and their it's called Personal Accounts by Women in SNCC. So I'm just going to read this because this really sounds like if I had written the book, what I would have written. For the most part, growing up was joyful. I lived happily in my all-black world, surrounded by a loving family and wonderful teachers and church members. They showered me with tender care, support, and encouragement to reach the highest goals that I could imagine, in spite of the obstacles of race and gender. That would have been my writing had I written the book. I am Shirley Satterfield, born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to Alice May Satterfield and Claude Wayne Satterfield. My mother moved back to her town, where I was the 4th of 6 generations of the Van Zandt Moore May family. I was raised by my mother with the tender and spiritual care of my maternal grandmother. and the guidance of many aunts and uncles. During the first few years of my life, I lived with my mother, grandmother, and 3 uncles who had served their country in World War II. I attended kindergarten to 2nd grade at the Witherspoon School for Colored Children. A school started on Witherspoon Street in a building that was built in the 1870s to educate the colored children in the town. Betsy Stockton, slave to the noted Stockton family and missionary with the Stewart family, was the first teacher for the colored children. The town where I was raised and educated is Princeton, New Jersey, a northern town whose residents felt the pain of Jim Crowism and racial separation. There were separate communities, housing, churches, schools, fraternal organizations, YM and WCA, segregated cemetery, businesses, restaurants, and movie theater. I bet you didn't know that, did you? On Memorial Day, the tradition was for us to decorate the graves of our relatives, and all of my relatives are in the colored section of the Princeton Cemetery. I was in 2nd grade when the Princeton Plan was instituted to integrate the elementary schools in Princeton Borough, Witherspoon School for Colored Children, and Nassau Street Elementary School. I entered 3rd grade at Nassau Street Elementary School and quickly noticed the difference in how I was taught and treated. Even though I grew up in a segregated town, it wasn't until the schools were integrated that I really knew what segregation meant. When I graduated from Princeton High School in 1958, it was the same year that the United States Congress passed the first Civil Rights Act. I matriculated at Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, and faced more discrimination. Facing discrimination in the South was not too much different than what I had experienced in Princeton, except in the South it was in your face. This was the time when the civil rights movement was in full force, a time of beatings, lynchings, hangings, killings, cross burnings, separate facilities for schools, churches, buses, trains, restrooms, and water fountains. A period in our history when there were protests, marches, sit-ins, student bus trips to the South, boycotts, jailing, posing, and freedom songs. And we say we shall overcome so many times I could sing it backward. The civil rights movement was prevalent between 1955 and 1968, a movement of black and white in support of equality in education, employment, race relations, and even to protest against the Vietnam War. Several circumstances led to the civil rights movement for hundreds of years of slavery to racism and discrimination. Another influence for the civil rights movement was when, in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, an elderly Negro woman, refused to give up her seat on the bus so a white man could sit down. Mrs. Parks' refusal to go to the back of the bus resulted in her arrest. Because she was jailed for keeping her dignity, the Negro people in Montgomery started a bus boycott. It was at this time that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King began to encourage nonviolent movements. During the civil rights movement, several organizations were formed to address many injustices, such as SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Militant groups such as the Black Panthers were formed because many Negroes were frustrated with the nonviolent movements. One of the nonviolent protests were sit-ins. In the southern states, there were many restaurants, theaters, and public places where colored people could not patronize. Sit-ins were started as a way to end segregated seating in restaurants and at lunch counters. Many Presbyterian ministers from across the United States joined the sit-ins. In Presbyterian publications, the message was clear that it could not be said that the church was not there. In 1960, Dr. King was arrested for a term of 4 months during a sit-in. This was a nonviolent protest to have the right to eat at a lunch counter. With the intervention of then President John Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy, Dr. King was released from jail. On Monday, February 1st, 1960, 4 students from A&T University in Greensboro, North Carolina, Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair Jr., and David Richmond, called the Greensboro Four, entered the F.W. Woolworth store in Greensboro, North Carolina at 4:30 p.m. and purchased merchandise at several counters. They sat down at the white-only lunch counter and ordered coffee. They were denied service, ignored, and then asked to leave. They remained seated at the counter until the store closed early at 5 p.m. The 4 immediately returned to campus and recruited others to join them. On Tuesday, February 2nd, 25 men from A&T, along with 4 women, returned to F.W. Woolworth. The students sat from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. while white patrons heckled them. They just sat with books and studied to keep them busy. They were refused service. On Wednesday, February 3rd, more than 60 students, 1/3 of them female, returned to Woolworth store and sat down at every available lunch counter seat. Students from Bennett College and Dudley High School increased the number of protesters. On February 4th, I joined my Bennett sisters and along with students from A&T University, Greensboro College, several other local colleges, and students from the high schools marched peacefully downtown Greensboro to sit at Woolworth's lunch counter. There were hundreds of Negro and white students marching through the streets of Greensboro, and as we marched, there were white people along the sidewalk shouting, calling us the N-word, and throwing things at us. Because we were following Dr. King's nonviolent methods of protesting, we could not retaliate or even respond. We would be harmed, we were afraid we would be harmed or shot at. When we reached Woolworth's, we entered and sat at the stools on the lunch counter. When many of us did sit, we were pushed, hit, spit on, and continually being called the N-word. There was even a protester whose coat was set on fire. From February to August, students marched, sat at the counters, and formed student executive committees to meet with the representatives from F.W. Woolworth's. Tensions mounted when white students continued their heckling, swearing, and yelling. All protests, marches, sit-ins, and rallies were nonviolent. By the 5th month, sit-ins were over, thousands of students had demonstrated, and many were jailed. On Tuesday, July 26, 1960, F.W. Woolworth's was desegregated. This was the first successful nonviolent sit-in in the South, and the 4 students from A&T University had gone down in history as being the first students to initiate the sit-ins. Negro and white people were eating together at Woolworth's lunch counter because of the efforts of the Greensboro Four and Dr. King's nonviolent protests. All the stores in the South opened their lunch counters. By August 1961, more than 70,000 people participated in the sit-ins. More than 3,000 were arrested, and the lunch counter protests have inspired kneel-ins in churches, sleep-ins at segregated motel lobbies, swim-ins at segregated pools, wade-ins at segregated beaches, read-ins at segregated libraries, play-ins at segregated parks, and watch-ins at segregated movies. What kept us going were the nonviolent teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King, many prayers, related sermons during my college vesper services, and continued protest songs, such as We Shall Overcome. The commitment and faithfulness of Negro and white students was the strength that kept us focused and determined. Dr. King's message about nonviolence states, Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The need for mankind to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to oppression and violence. Mankind must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. In 1963, when Dr. King was in the Birmingham jail for 11 days, he wrote the noted letter from the Birmingham jail. His letter was addressed to ministers who he knew. In his letter, he explains why Negroes cannot wait any longer for freedom and integration. In one section, he states, oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself, and that is what has happened to the American Negro. Something with has reminded him of his birthright of freedom. Something without has reminded him it can be obtained. The United States Negro is moving with a sense of great urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. There are some parallels between my life in a segregated society and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's dedication to promoting justice for all. All of his adult life he spent preaching, teaching, speaking, marching, participating in sit-ins, being jailed, and directing nonviolent protests. I continue to conduct tours and uplift the contributions of a proud community and to educate the Princeton community and visitors about the contributions and survival of residents who lived in a segregated town. I have felt the pains of segregated housing, education, and the frustration of being told where I could or could not live. Through it all, like the proud colored, Negro, Black, and African Americans, I survived the sting of Jim Crowism, segregation, and racism. Thank you.
I'm going to say a few words before I begin to talk. and I'll tell you when I start. First of all, I'm going to say I'm glad to be here. We're closer to October than we were from October. Because in October, I will celebrate 63 years as an ordained Presbyterian minister. And know how to get back home. I want to give praise and thanks to members of my congregation and promise you what I say this evening, I will not say again Sunday. I didn't say it last Sunday either. So come on back Sunday, it'll be different. I want to also say to Myra that as she knows, I want to serve on this board. She's a native Kentuckian. See, I learned how to bleed Kentucky blue before I learned how to bleed Presbyterian blue. And the other thing is that the church has been good. And I'll say some things about that as I make this journey into this. So now I'm going to start. Wilcox County, Alabama, about 70 miles north of Mobile, 40 miles south of Selma, was and still is maybe one of the 20 poorest counties in America. In 1948, it had been dubbed by the Pittsburgh Courier as the hellhole of Alabama. It's in the heart of the Black Belt. And the Black Belt does not refer primarily to black people. It refers to the black loamy soil that stretches across that southern part of Alabama, Georgia, and all the way across to Texas and Mississippi. But it also produced many, many black slaves in that particular section. Wilcox County, Alabama when I was there, population was 85% black. In my 9 years of ministry there, no one had attempted to register to vote. I began my ministry there in 1949. Pastor 3 congregations. I was married in Wilcox County. We have 2 children born in Wilcox County, Alabama. I was a very active pastor in rural life, nominated as the Rural Minister of the Year in 1956. But there was always that nagging thing inside of me. Why is it that I cannot vote? So beginning in the early part of 1956, with all that had happened in 1954, with the Brown versus Board of Education, all that had happened in Tuskegee with the Tuskegee boycott in 1954, the Montgomery boycott in 1955 through 56. So I'm saying sometimes things grab you because of the circumstances in which you are. So they grabbed me. I wanted to register and to vote. At that time in Alabama, there were 3 registrars assigned to this county. The list of names appeared in the Montgomery Advertiser. I knew visually one of the registrars in Wilcox County. She and her husband ran a department store, furniture store. Visually, that's how I didn't know her personally, but I knew her visually. 18 months I spent trying to find where was the place to register. 18 months. Because earlier that time, at the beginning of that period, another black minister who was also an upholsterer had said to me, they're going to let us vote. They're going to let me vote. 18 months later, I came back to him. I said, are they going to let you vote? He said, no. I'm going to tell you where it is. He told me. Now, for twice a month, for 18 months, I've been trying to find it. I walked out of his upholstery shop, went over to the courthouse, walked out, there were the 2 registrars sitting. As I said, I knew one of them visually. I said, I'd like to have a way to register to vote. And the silence was deafening. And finally, the woman looked up and said, I don't know what you're talking about. Now, I'm alive today because I didn't challenge her. Then she said the second statement. She said, you have to go see the judge of probate. Now, in Alabama, at that time, you were assigned a ballot. You registered, you had to go to the judge of probate to get approval. Well, I'm out there, so I'm going to stay. So I go to the judge of probate. I still don't know whether he actually didn't hear what I said. I walked in his search and they said, what can I help you? I said, I want to get a form to register to vote. And he said, what did he say? I don't know whether he was deaf that day or most days. And he said, I don't have any. That was the end of it. It is true, he didn't have any. So I go back into the black community. As I said, by that time I'd been there since 49. I tried to find someone, just someone, who would be willing to go with me on a Monday, the place where they sat, and try to get a form. I could not find anyone. This is a county, 85% black. Short forward, 1958, Sunday morning, I'm teaching Sunday school. The telephone rings in the principal's office. The Sunday school class was next door to his office. It was a call from the representative of the Civil Rights Commission. The voice said, I have heard that you tried to register in Wilcox County. I said, yes. we would like to hear some more about what it is that happened to you. I said, okay, you can come down Monday and I'll be glad to talk to you. He said, no. And went 2 or 3 swear words, said, I'm not coming back down to that county. This is a Caucasian. We've been treated badly when he had come on Friday and said he was not coming back to that county. So there were 2 trips that I made to Montgomery. I got 3 friends and we drove up to Montgomery on that Sunday evening. Met with the members of the Civil Rights Commission. Told them my story about being denied an opportunity to register to vote. And heard from them, we cannot give you any protection. Therefore, we would advise you not to come and make a public statement tomorrow. But what we would like for you to do is to come early in the morning before the hearings before the Civil Rights Commission takes place and give your testimony to Father Heshbar. As you may know, at that time, Father Theodore Heshbar was the chair of the Civil Rights Commission. So on early Monday morning, I drove back to Montgomery, went by and had a long conversation with Dr. Heshbar about my experience in trying to become a registered voter in Wilcox County. So if you look in the proceedings of the Civil Rights Commission, in one of the latter pages of that report, you'll find the report that I gave. So that day, as I was walking around listening to other people, in my back pocket I had a form that I had gotten because we were moving from Wilcox County to Knoxville, Tennessee at the end of 1958. And I'd gone over to talk to the person about the moving van. And I had in my back pocket the folder from the moving van. I looked up, there was the deputy sheriff of Wilcox County and the woman who had been the registrar following me around to see if what I had in my back pocket was a subpoena.
Oh my.
Into the restroom, out of the restroom, down the hall. When I discovered what they were trying to do, then I sort of flaunted it, even though it was not a subpoena. And finally, he got close enough to me to see that it was not a subpoena. And with 2 other words that I don't want to use now, he said, that's not a subpoena. Now, there are various things. I've said one of them about what motivates you to do this. The second thing that motivates you sometimes to do the thing is total recklessness. Recklessness. I called Neola, my wife, and said we had 2 children at that time. Her grandmother was living with us. I called, I said, Nee, can you get your grandmother ready and the 2 children ready? And can you be able to leave Wilcox County? Because I'm going in here and testify. Well, one is blessed most times with a wife with a great deal more sense. She said, Jimmy, I can't do that. So here again, I'm here because of that. But I think one of the things that drives persons into taking on situations that are difficult, the recklessness of participation, the foolishness of participation, but there is never the hopelessness of participation. You always believe there's something that's going to happen and will happen that make it possible. So now I want to fast forward to 1964 bill. I go back to Wilcox County. I'll say a word about the church as enumerate this going back. The Presbyterian Church has a commitment to inclusiveness and justice greater than any other denomination in all of Christendom. I worked for the National Council of Churches. I can stand here and say no other denomination has been more committed to inclusiveness and justice than Presbyterians have. Even the new form of government. Every council above the session has to have a committee on representation. No other denomination in Christendom has made that. The congregations in that part of Alabama, 5 of them, had been started by the United Presbyterian Church of North America. The executive for this presbytery, Lucy Rupert, knows that the Presbyterian Church of North America did not have many congregations south of the Mason-Dixon. They had where her father pastored in Kentucky, 5 in Alabama, 2 in Tennessee, 2 in North Carolina, and 2 in Virginia. So any time that you think about you going a long way for a Presbyterian meeting, I have to go once every 3rd year from Wilcox County, Alabama to Norfolk, Virginia, 925 miles. Piece of cake. Now, so in that configuration, the churches in Alabama had never been a part of a racially segregated presbytery except by location. So the 5 churches there were members of Union Presbyterian in the vicinity around Knoxville, Tennessee. But they had not ever sent a commissioner to a Presbyterian meeting from 1958 until 1964. So the Presbyterian decided we would take the Presbyterian to the churches. The state clerk of the Presbyterian, Geddes Orman, the moderator of the Presbyterian, and Jim Reese drove out of Knoxville on our way back to Wilcox County. I knew exactly how to do it. I sat in the back seat all the way down. We stopped and ate dinner at a black restaurant in Birmingham. Got to Wilcox County. I didn't understand. I'd been there 9 years, so people knew me. When we stopped to get gas at the filling station, one of the black attendants came out and he looked at me, Reverend Reese. Well, by that time, I could not hide because he'd already called my name. We did our ministry of business that evening. I stayed in the home of a principal. The 2 white ministers stayed in the home, went to the hotel. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the owner of the hotel came, knocked on the door, said, I don't want you civil rights agitators in my hotel. Opened the door, and as they were putting on their clothes and trying to leave, he began to beat them with a shotgun. He beat them so badly that the stock and the barrel separated. They put their clothes on, came out. A shot was fired. We have no idea whether the shot was fired at them or just as a warning. They had no idea because they'd never been in Wilcox County before. So they came to where I was living. The principal came, knocked on the door. I went to the door. He said, don't turn the light on. I come out. There's Geddes Orman, the state clerk, standing there, beaten, not knowing what's going to happen. While we were standing doubting where Eric Stewart was, he appeared. One arm hanging limp by his side. The shotgun had broken that arm. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. The 2 people there, the ministers who lived next door, and the principal said, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know whether anybody is coming after y'all or not. I said, give me a set of keys and a vehicle. I drove the first 15 miles, never turned the lights on, and never touched the brakes. In fact, I think if I had moved my foot off the accelerator, I could have trimmed it, so I never would have found it. I got to sell them. I take them by the home of a minister, a black minister, and then I decided I'm going to hide this car. I drive around building when you were saying about what color lights are. A policeman comes up to me, stops, and he said, "What are you doing back here?" I said, "What?" He said, "Didn't I see this car parked on Jeff Davis?" That's the name of the street. Now, you told a white lie. I told a colored lie. I said, "Jeff Davis, what's that?" He said, "That's the street." I said, "No, I don't." I said, "I'm lost. I don't have any idea where Jeff Davis is." I still believe that he had been notified that perhaps this would come. But so I said, the cat's out. So I drive the car back around and park it on Jeff Davis. Well, Alex, whose arm was broken, would not permit us to take him to a hospital in Selma. He insisted on being flown back to Knoxville to get the medical aid that he needed. So that morning, we got someone out of Selma to fly Black driving to Birmingham, and he flew back to Knoxville. Now, I'm still in Alabama with this car, which happened to be a DeSoto. Red top and a black body. In the meantime, the United Press had gotten word of what had happened. They had called me over. I had not called and told her anything because I did not want to disturb the family. I didn't know how I was going to get back. So I waited until it became dark. I drove to Birmingham and then drove out the next morning. So if you go now to the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham, look down through the plaques of the persons who something happened. When you get to 1964, there's a plaque, there's a little tag that says 2 white ministers and a black minister were beaten and chased out of Alabama. The things for which we normally take for granted, many of us had to give a lot for that to happen. And no one really can know what motivates you to do this. No one really knows how the adrenaline and the pieces come together to make it possible that you want to do something because of what has been denied you. I still remember my grandmother walking across saying, "Ethiopia is going to stretch forth her hand." Maybe way back there. Or maybe it happened as being a Presbyterian. Because when the UP Church of North America was formed, it had a standard that said, you cannot receive communion and hold a slave. So I feel greatly privileged to belong to a group that takes this seriously. I think greatly so much of what has happened to me and hard part of the Civil Rights Movement. The March on Washington, yes, I was there. The church has given us an opportunity to be what we can be and for all of us to look forward to justice and equality. So, in addition to being proud to be a minister, I'm glad to be a Presbyterian one.
I was to be speaking fourth, but it's 10 after 7 now, and I've taught for 40 some odd years, and I know that the quitting time is pretty sacrosanct. And so and we had a question and answer or response time in. I think it's much more important to have a time for questions and answers and responses. So let's take another 5 minutes, if that's okay. And I will save my remarks and put them on videotape sometime for use elsewhere. But responses, questions, I'm Louis Weeks, by the way, Fred a member of the board and retired preacher. Yes.
This is a simple question. Ms. Satterfield, you mentioned the church, the college called ANC. I can do agriculture, but I can't go beyond that.
A&T, agricultural technical.
Technical?
Yeah.
Oh, and was
A&T.
so
Yes,
it's agriculture and.
A&T.
A&T. Okay, thank you.
Is a really important college. Others? Ms. Reese, you want to make a rebuttal? Go ahead.
Yes, just to all of you. There was such a struggle in the Voting Rights Act that took place and all, and now and again we have this problem approaching us concerning photo identification and the new effort that's being put out to re-identify yourself as being a citizen of the United States. What's going to happen with that? Is there going to be battle lines drawn, or are we just going to sit
That's a great
quietly?
question. Any panelists want to respond?
I think there will be. We've decided at the congregation we're going to find ways to help as many persons as we can to get registered visually, with some visual way of doing that. Because I think it's going to be so difficult if you get there on that day and you don't have it. It's not going to be possible. So I think that it ought to be the whole community, not just African American, because it can happen to anyone. So I think here's something, a new thing, a new civil rights piece that does not have a color line attached to it, but one which we ought to begin to think about in organized ways by which we can get more and more people to
But
have
Jim, if it doesn't have a color line, it sure got color under it.
It's sort of like when the slaves were freed and we had Reconstruction, so the KKK came along because they were afraid Negroes would have power. So it's basically the same thing. We have a black president, and there's a lot of retaliation, there's a lot of hatred, and now they're trying to find ways to keep us from voting. So it's like all that hatred's coming back.
It's a sharp issue in Pennsylvania as well as Virginia.
Yes.
Yes, so
Yes.
it's kind of marching orders for vote.
Well, there's a new effort now where a lot of people are going to be purged from the voting rolls.
Yeah.
And you're only going to have just a short amount of time in order to set up your protest and get your proof together to re-qualify yourself.
Yes.
Any of you, do you think that now that Caucasians or whites are going to be a minority, just like the Hispanics or the blacks or the Asians or what have you, is that going to be, what impact do you think that's going to have on the prejudice and the ability of different people to get along with each other?
I think that whites aren't truly going to be a minority, maybe in numbers, but not in terms of economic power for a long time. And until there is some equality in terms of resources, I think that other, former minorities, including Hispanics and African Americans, are still going to have a problem with discrimination in one form or another. The problem is not going to go away until resources and support have somewhat equalized.
The problem is not that race is the problem, is the fact that we're called minority.
Amen.
Get rid of minority and just call us people. I don't think
Yes.
I have a question, Shirley, of you, and I think you brought this out, but I'd like to get a little more about this. So much of what we thought about the Civil Rights Act and all of the discrimination we thought about taking place in the South. And what you talked about was you who lived here in Princeton, which was, right here in the Northeast. And I was curious, your own experience in growing up of how you might compare the kind of discrimination and the kind of hatred and the kind of issues that people who grew up in the South, how that was the same of what you experienced and how it might have been different?
When I grew up in Princeton, I didn't even know what segregation was because our parents didn't talk about segregation because we had everything in our community. We had stores, we had barbershops, we had beauty parlors. Almost every house had a little candy store or a little ice cream parlor. So, and then we had one street that had our grocery stores and our candy stores, and they were different. Like we had a grocery store that was owned by Italians. We had a restaurant that was owned by a Greek. And we had a candy store that was owned by, we used to call her the Jew lady. And we would say we're going to the Jew ladies. We had no idea as little kids what Jew meant. It's just that she was a Jewish lady and we called her the Jew lady. So all of our things were right in the community because we couldn't go to stores on Nassau Street. And Nassau Street is a main street in Princeton. And so everything was in our community, including caring teachers. And the black teachers, well, we were colored then, so that's why I always said colored Negro, because we weren't colored that. And our teachers were part of the community and part of our churches. So what we had in our community were caring parents, caring teachers, caring neighborhood, our churches, and the colored Y. And the Y was not integrated until the 1950s. So when they integrated the schools in 1947, Governor Driscoll passed the Desegregation Act that all schools in New Jersey had to be integrated. So they started something called the Princeton Plan in my town. And there were two schools. There was a Nassau Street School for white kids and the Witherspoon School for colored children. And when they started the Princeton Plan, what they did is Witherspoon became the junior high school for all of the students in the borough, and Nassau Street became the elementary school. So when they found out that we were going to be integrated, a lot of the white parents sent their kids to private school rather than have them come in our neighborhood. So when I went to Nassau, I was treated differently. I was not, the teachers didn't teach us the same. They separated us in classes. And that's when I knew what segregation was. Because I didn't feel segregated in my own community with caring teachers. It wasn't until they integrated the schools that so I grew up in a segregated town and didn't know what segregation was until they integrated the schools. And once they integrated the schools, then they opened up the stores for us to go to on Nassau Street. But if you come to Princeton, you can still feel that sense because we still live in the African American community, even though it's now integrated.
This is true in areas of the South as well. Katie Cannon, who's a member of the faculty at Union, who's the first African-American woman ordained in the Presbyterian Church, USA. Katie says she grew up thinking all Presbyterians were black. She was from Kannapolis, the unincorporated area outside of Charlotte, and the support structure there was very, very strong for African-Americans, and she felt nurtured all through her growing up, and then really did not until she got to college did she sense the power of segregation, which was an experience that I had as a white guy growing up in Memphis. Time has come for us to conclude. Let's say another word of thanks to the panelists. It's a really personal one today. God bless you.